Uğur donuyor hocanın konuşması. Sometimes you pause. Is it because of your
I don't know.
internet? I don't know either. Okay.
I don't know.
So welcome everyone. We have like 25 students here. Unfortunately, some of them couldn't be able to attend because they have this midterm week, which we couldn't really thought about it while planning it before. If you just excuse me for a brief moment, I would like to introduce you to my students. And while I was studying from Wikipedia, that's where, Caetano Galindo has a page in Wikipedia. And I thought that it would be better maybe if I could have one more hour, to present him to you with all his works and his biography. So really, I need a presentation here. He teaches at Universidade Federal do Paraná in Curitiba. For over 20 years. He had been in the administration as well. And indeed, he's a scholar in the department. And however, and also he had translated more than 50 books from English, mostly English, from Italian, from Romanian, from Danish, and some of the works he had translated from English are the things that our students are familiar with. Thomas Pynchon, David Foster Wallace, Salinger, James Joyce Ulysses, Tom Stoppard, Alice Smith, the latest book of the Nobel Prize winner Abdullah Gurzah. He had translated poems from Leonard Cohen to Bob Dylan, Paul Auster, and many, many other more novels and short stories and great works by great authors. And he had won many prizes in Brazil with his translation of James Joyce's works, especially Ulysses. And in this centennial edition, he had retranslated his translation again. It's a huge work, I believe. Congratulations for that. And also, apart from his translations and his academic work, he is also an author. He has sorry, people are coming. He has written a book, Sobres Canibais, which is about the cannibals. He has this short stories. He has also written Onze Poemas. He has poetry books and another one upcoming. He has been writing in a plural journal, Elia, a kind of a weekly short story, a kind of a short story, a modernist one, and we are all expecting it to be published as well. And apart from that, he has also published Simiojigo, yes, I say yes, a study guide, which is the only study guide in Portuguese to James Joyce Ulysses. It's also a very prominent work. There are lots of things that I would like to say about him, and more than that, he is also a musician, a composer. He could be able to play many instruments, and he has many works of he had composed and written the lyrics. So it's an honor to have you here in Turkey, Caetano Galindo, Professor Caetano Galindo. The floor is yours. Thank you very much again.
Well, I'm definitely the one who has something to thank now. We should have done this in Turkish so that I wouldn't be like embarrassed now by all these things, these nice things. I'm very thankful for your presentation, Dr. Esra Starhan. I'm trying to say correctly the names in Turkish. The first thing I have to tell you guys, who I cannot see here, you're just small balls with names, is how much I love your names. Like, Turkish names are the best names ever. They sound just like, I don't know, they're just beautiful to see. And I have to thank you all for this and for the patience you'll have to exercise while listening to me, because I tend to talk too much. And please complain along the way about anything, and please share your questions, your doubts, or whatever. I don't know how you've been doing this, if it's being like on the chat, or if you can raise your hands or whatever. We will deal with that however it comes. I have to thank Professor Starhan once more for the invitation. It's amazing to be here, to be talking to you guys, and to be seeing Professor Starhan again. And even though Kermit has not resisted and is now officially dead behind her. I can see that, so that points to some sadness in my participation, in contrast to what Dr. Mahazawil had here a few weeks before. Is it already weeks? I don't remember. Yeah, so thank you all. It's really a privilege and a joy to be here and to be talking about T.S. Eliot and tradition, invention, innovation. Yeah, that's my book. That's my book. It looks really good. I'm very fortunate that you cannot read it, you guys, so you cannot know all the flaws it certainly has. But the cover is amazing, and it translates very well to Turkish or to any other language. So yeah, I'm very happy to be here, and let's just see how this goes. I am, as Professor Osterhan never tires of reminding me, I am old, and I have to tell you that it never ceases to amaze me, this idea that we can be here talking to each other across an ocean and across 6 hours of time difference and be able to, you know, teach and listen to you and see you guys is just awesome for an old guy like me. So let's get to it. T.S. Eliot is, of course, a very known name. It's a very famous person, maybe one of the most famous poets in the 20th century. He has written in English, which puts him in a very favorable position to be at the center of the canon. He has been a very influential figure in Anglophone letters, because he's not only the poet who won the Nobel Prize, but also a playwright. By the end of his career, he was concentrating especially in writing for the theater. And he is also a literary critic. And as a literary critic, he would have been someone we would have been talking about right now, because he has changed the critical scenery. He has created some concepts, some definitions. He has written about certain periods of English literature that were not really deeply studied when he began his work. So he really changed the landscape of literary criticism in English. And as if that was not enough, he's also one of the most famous editors in the 20th century. He was the first big name behind Faber and Faber, which is to this day a very important publishing house. He was the first guy who came there and gave them like their identity and their role in promoting new literature and becoming this very highbrow publishing house in London. So what else could we ask from someone who is in this field of the letters? He has written creatively, he has written as a critic, he has written in more than one genre, and he has been a publisher. He is perhaps best known for most people in the late 20th and early 21st century as the guy who wrote the poems behind the musical Cats. He wrote those poems, yeah, in theory as letters to his godson and to some nephews and to some children of his friends. They were like private things that he wrote for kids. He loved to write playful poems for kids. And after he had published most of his serious poetry, he decided to publish this book. It was quite a different situation because he was like the famous publisher in London, and he presented the book to his own publishing house. Like he presented it to Faber and Faber because they were the best house for the book. But he did this under a pseudonym because he didn't want to be, I don't know, to be put ahead of the list just because he was the boss. And it's kind of curious because the book had two different readers inside Faber and Faber, and one of them hated the book and the other loved it. But in the end, they decided to publish it, only to discover that it was by the boss. And a few decades later, the thing became the most unlikely of all musicals and the most unlikely of all successes, one of the most successful musicals of all the 20th century. That is kind of ironical because Eliot was not a very lowbrow person. He was not deeply connected to pop culture, to popular culture in his public persona. He had a deep-seated love for music and the music hall and theater, but as a public voice, he was very erudite and very highbrow. And it's kind of ironical that his most known work today is this series of poems about cats. Amazing poems, though they are. So that's the guy. What's his work have to do with tradition and innovation, which is supposed to be our theme here today? Well, he was placed in this very special window of time. He was born in the 80s, in 1886, the 19th century. So he was 4 years younger than Virginia Woolf and James Joyce, for instance. Yeah, it took me all of 7 minutes to mention Joyce for the first time. I'll get there more and more along the way. Yeah, it's just the first time, believe you me. He was therefore a member of this generation that would reshape the English literature and world literature through what we call today high modernism or modernism, full stop. And those works converged in a very meaningful way in the year 1922, or be it said 100 years ago. Modernism was like at its peak in the English-speaking world. I have to tell you that that is also true for Brazil. We had our Modern Art Week in 1922 in February, and so it's like when modernism arrives officially in Brazil. And I was doing my very hasty prep work for this today, and I discovered that free verse also arrives in Turkey in 1922, thanks to a guy called, please forgive my Turkish, Nazım Hikmet, is it? Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, cool. Thank you. So yeah, it's a very important year, and we'll get there in a few minutes. He comes from the United States, and you have to remember, and I have to tell you this, because when I speak to you guys, I'm always like in awe with the notion of history and tradition and the past that surrounds you. You are right now in a world that dates back to thousands of years ago. Izmir is like one of the oldest cities in the world, and I am here in a city that has 300 years of history in a country that exists for 500 years. So our notion of the past and of tradition is quite different than yours, and it has to be. And that has some influences on how we think about the past and how we deal with tradition. So in America, in the United States, things were not that different in the 19th century. Their idea of innovation, their idea of breaking with the past and creating something new and breaking new ground and inventing new forms for literature was in a way even more acute than what we had in Europe with the Romantics and then with, I don't know, the French modern writers like Baudelaire and even Mallarmé, and the specialist is right by my side, so I have to say this not in a very loud voice because I may say something wrong. What they were doing in America was in a way freer and in a way riskier. They did not have all the weight of the centuries of history that Europe had to like drag behind its work. So when we look at what they were doing in the mid 19th century, like 1850s, and we see that in America they were publishing Moby Dick. Well, Moby Dick is a radically modern novel, absolutely different than anything people were doing in Europe. And that was perhaps only possible in America, in the New World, where there was no such bounds, where people could be new and could invent in a more, I could almost say, irresponsible way. Well, alongside with Herman Melville, who was writing Moby Dick, we had another figure. That was Walt Whitman. Whitman was himself a person from a different world. I used to tell people that you only have to go to Google and look for a pic of Charles Baudelaire on the one hand and a pic of Walt Whitman on the other, and you will see a guy from the 19th century with a weird collar in his shirt and a flowing cravat, and on the other hand you would see a New York hipster, a guy with an open shirt and weird hair and a beard, and who looks pretty much like one of us, one of our friends. And this difference in image, and we have to remember that Whitman had his image on the cover of his first book, of his major book, was already like a sign of what was going on. They were not people in ties, people tied to a different world. They were barbarians. They were irresponsible peasants from the point of view of an European. Why am I talking about Whitman? First of all, because Whitman is cool. You have to read him. And second, because what he did to poetry was going to be very important to modernism and to Eliot and to Hikmet, as I have just recently learned, because he broke with the idea that poetry was to be written in measured lines. You all know about that. Most poetry in English was written in what we call Iambic Pentameter, or 10 beat lines with 10 syllables, with a predictable distribution of stresses, of accents along the way, and most usually with a lot of rhyme. So you would look at a sonnet written by the Romantics or by the Elizabethans or by the metaphysic poets, as Eliot would call them, and you would find the same structure. You would find a recognizable structure. The lines are all pretty much the same size. When you read them aloud, they have the same number of syllables, the same number of beats and pulses and stresses, and they have a lot of rhyme. Well, you get to Whitman and everything changes. He writes in very long lines of unequal size with no rhyme at all and no formal recognizable structure. There is no number to his lines. They don't have 10 syllables or 12 or 8 or whatever. He writes in something that looks like prose, broken in uneven sized lines. It has a deep connection to the Bible, the way the Bible is divided in verses, and those verses are not poetry in our sense of the word, but they have this idea of a clause, of a sentence that gives some meaning, and it has also some profound connections to preaching, to how people preach in the church. The rhythms, the use of sound effects, and even rhymes in the middle of the lines, but nothing like strict, nothing obligatory, nothing mandatory, nothing that was to tie the poet down to a form. He was free, he was flowing, he was in a certain way quite closer to a hip-hop MC than to a traditional romantic poet. He was letting the language, the flow of the language, guide the direction of his poetry. That was to be very important. Whitman is the first person to write a huge corpus of work in free verse. No rhyme, no meter. Curiously, this innovation was well received in France a few years later, and it was from France that it was later distributed to the whole world. The guy who was responsible for doing this in France was, as a matter of fact, a translator of Whitman's poems. So he was reading Whitman and translating them to French, and then in French it became like a thing. People loved it and even called it, even during like the 20th century in America, people would call it vers libre in French, even though it was invented right there in the United States by this weird guy a few decades before. Well, Eliot was no exception. He read the French writers of the period. He was a profound admirer of Jules Laforgue, which was this guy who was translating Whitman to French. And he had deep connections to Europe, and we will have to come to that. He even went to live in London and spent his whole life there. He was even naturalized as a British citizen by the end of his life. But when he was in Harvard, when he was studying in the States, he discovered a lot of things. He discovered the East, and he studied a lot of Eastern philosophy. He discovered this French poetry, this new French poetry that was full of allure to him, and he ordered Laforgue's book of poems, and we have his letters from the period and his journal entries, and he was like on tenterhooks for weeks because he ordered the book and the book did not arrive, and he was like crazy because it was not today. They did not have Kindle and Amazon, and you had to wait for weeks and maybe months for an imported book. I, an old man, remember those times. I was living in not a very large city in Brazil, and if you wanted an imported book, you have to wait sometimes up to 3 months to put your hands on the book. So he bought this book, he read this book, he annotated this book, and it had a very deep influence on him. In 1915, he publishes his first collection of poetry. So he was almost turning 30, which is not exactly early for a poet. Poets tend to be precocious, unlike prose writers. It's not rare that you find that the major part of a poet's most famous work was produced between his 20s and his early 30s. Eliot makes his first move in poetry when he's already close to 30, which is something different. This first collection is called, it had 2 titles, one in England and one in the United States. But let's keep to the most famous title. It was called Proofrock and Other Observations. So Proofrock is the name of this character that was to reappear in some of his poems. No one really knows where did he get this name from, probably from a store in his native town of St. Louis, but it's probably something that really only pleased him because of the sound. This absurd name, Proofrock, not something very, it's not like Smith or even Eliot. It's not a common name. The first poem of this first book is called The Love Song of J. Alfred Proofrock. So this poem is something we could really learn from. I am not going to show you slides and PowerPoint thingies because 1, I am old, and 2, I get confused with these things. I am a talker, so please, if you have something to like complain about that or ask, please feel at ease. But well, the poem is very easy to find online, and it's a joy to read. Not exactly a joy, though. What about this poem? It is already a very clear break with poetic tradition and a very clear signal of where things were going with Eliot and with his generation. First of all, it has this weird title, The Love Song of J. Alfred Proofrock, where it seems to be very specific, there's the name of this guy. At the same time, you don't have his name. He's called J. Alfred, which is kind of weird because most Americans tend to use an initial for their middle name. So if he was called like James A. Proofrock, that would be real normal. But J. Alfred, it's kind of strange. We don't know his name. And the poem is called The Love Song of Such and Such. And when you read it, there's not much love in there, although there is a bit of a song. It's kind of a disillusioned poem that ends in old age and deep under sea. So it's not like the idea you may have of a love song. There is even a scene that some people relate not necessarily to rape, but to something like sexual harassment. The only thing that happens there seems to be that he tries to force himself onto a woman and is not really well received. So, well, 1 second, coffee. And I'm back. There's this contrast of the title and the poem. It's a long poem divided in sections, which is something that he would do other times in his career. But I would like to talk to you only about the first few lines. The poem opens with a very famous line. It's, "Let us go then, you and I." Which is a very beautiful flowing line and also a very different way to open a poem collection, because you're talking to someone and the someone is maybe the reader or is maybe someone else, and it's a beautiful move because it's like the first line of the book and you open it and the book talks to you and say, "Come with me, let us go then, you and I." We don't really know who this I is, which is something very typical of Eliot's poetry and very atypical of what we might call traditional poetry before him, where there is a very strong identification of the I that speaks in the poem and the biographical I of the poet. When you read like Byron, you know that it's Byron speaking to you, unless you're reading one of the dramatic poems. When you read Shelley, when you read Keats, when you read whoever, even Whitman, you know, especially Whitman, you know that the I in the poem is somehow and very deeply related to the I of the poet, the person behind the text, behind the words. In Eliot, that it's not so clear. His eyes tend to be characters, tend to be voices different than himself. In this case, the I might very easily be this guy from the title. So Proofrock might be the one speaking to you. And again, this is not necessarily like new in terms of being like the first time in the history of poetry. Not at all. Robert Browning was doing this decades before. Whitman had a very complicated relation between what he called I and what he called myself. Sometimes it's like he had like two voices and they talked to each other. That happens. That was something that was possible, but it was not the most typical way of dealing with lyrical poetry, and especially not the most typical way of opening your first book. So there's one thing. This guy is getting closer to what we might call prose, we might call fiction. This idea of the writer that creates characters and is not necessarily identifiable with any one of them. That's one thing. But there's a formal thing happening here, and I am a sucker for formal matters. So let's go there. Let us go then, you and I, to see what's happening here. People talk a lot about Eliot and his connection to free verse. That's very important to him. That was the first thing that I said to you guys, that he was one of the guys involved with the spread of free verse. At the same time, he famously said once that there is no free verse. And there is the second clause, because he writes, there is no free verse, for the man who's trying to do a good job. And let us forgive him his sexism. It was the early 20th century. He said the man with no excuses for the idea that some woman might one day try to write free verse as well. But the point to him was that free verse, as in writing with no concern about meter and regularity, was not a possibility. What he was doing himself was quite sophisticated and more interesting than that. What he was doing was that he was constantly trying to avoid writing 10 beat lines, 10 beat regular iambic pentameters, but at the same time remembering that the reader, whoever they might be, would have this expectation that poetry was supposed to be written like that. So what he did was he was like deviating from this standard, but keeping that standard in mind. So when you scan his first lines of the poem, you will see that they have sometimes 11 beats, sometimes 9, sometimes 12, sometimes 10, but they keep close to this pattern, this strict measure of 10 lines, of 10 beats, sorry, that was like the standard before him. He was just like, I don't know how many of you are into music history, but what happened in pretty much at the same time, in the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century, was the end of what we call tonal music, and people were beginning to write atonal music. But there was this moment in the meantime where people were just stretching the limits of the traditional system, making it sound almost unrecognizable, but they were still working within the rules. What Eliot was doing with his meter is somehow related to that. He was still working close to the system. He knew very well how the traditional system worked, but he was stretching its possibilities and working within the utmost possibilities of its limits to create something that to an unprepared ear would sound like free verse, would sound like prose, would sound that not like something that is clockwork in its regularity. And when you read like the cat poems, you know how he could be absolutely clockwork and precise when writing square poetry. That's not the feeling you get when you read those first lines. They seem to flow more freely, but when you look deeply at them, they are still quite close to what we sometimes call this ghost meter, this mysterious presence that seems to be like a limit in mathematical terms, something that you would never really get to, but you keep getting closer and closer to that. The same thing happens with rhymes. You don't really have formal structures of rhyme in this poetry, like those patterns where the first line rhymes with the fourth and the second rhymes with the third, and you have a very comfortable scheme like Asian, able, able, Asian, and you close the thing in a unit of 4 lines that is very typical of the sonnet in English, for instance. You don't have that. And people tend to look at that poetry and say that he was abolishing meter and he was abolishing rhyme, just like Whitman had done. But the point is, and that kind of baffles me, because as Professor Astarhan, do people call professors by their last names in Turkey? Because in Brazil we are very informal.
Well, they just say hocam, I think. Esra Hoca. Just
Oh,
vice
cool.
versa. I mean, Hoca is a kind of a teacher at the end. With the first name mostly, isn't it? Well, how do you call us? I don't know. Maybe just Esra while we are absent. Yes, it's Esra's class. I don't know. We used to call teachers like that.
Okay, so cool. I might know that from now on. What was I going to say? That's the point now. Why did I say that? I was talking about rhymes. Okay, oh yeah, she told you that I translated his poetry. and I was translating Proofrock, and there are lots of translations of this poem in Portuguese. We love translating things. We have, by this point, 5 Ulysses written in Portuguese, and we're going to have the 6th this year. We have probably more than 15 published translations of this one poem. And I was looking at them, and I was kind of baffled because no one seemed to have realized how deeply connected to rhyme the poem really was. And you look at the poem, please do that on your own after I stop speaking like crazy. And have a look at it, and you will see lots and lots of rhymes. And not only that, but they are rich rhymes. They are irregular rhymes, weird rhymes, poor rhymes, sophisticated rhymes. So he can rhyme some things like I and sky, which is obvious, is like a child's poetry rhyme, and that happens in the first 2 lines of the poem. Let us go then, you and I, when the evening is spread out against the sky. So this is like children poetry. But he can also rhyme the word visit with the phrase, is it? What is it? What is it? Visit. That's like hip-hop rhyming. That's something that happens across words. He can rhyme argument with intent, which is called a weak rhyme, because argument is the end is not tonic, and intent it is, so the stress is in different positions. Sorry, these are nerdy rhyme things, and I just love them. And he can also rhyme, by the end of the section, he can rhyme the women come and go, and the next line goes talking about Michelangelo. So Michelangelo is not stressed. The stress is way back in the word. So to make the line rhyme, you have to read it like the women come and go, talking about Michelangelo. You have to add this stress, which is horrible. It's like very bad rhyming. You're forcing the reader to make the rhyme by themselves. So he's not only rhyming, but he's like giving you an entire lesson about types of rhymes, and he's hiding that in unequal lines, lines of different sizes, lines of varied meter, and in weird positions along the poem, because the rhymes are not necessarily side by side. But this section that I'm talking about, the one that ends with Michelangelo, begins with a perfect rhyming couplet, I and sky, and ends with a perfect rhyming couplet, go and Michelangelo, although it's a very poor rhyme. And more than that, the section has 14 lines, which is the magical number of the sonnet. So he's kind of like writing a sonnet, but it's a very weird sonnet. He's innovating, he's creating, he's putting on something very new that sounded absolutely rule-breaking at that moment, but at the same time, he's keeping in mind a strong tradition and a strong link to that tradition. I'm sorry I brought you to that diversion along the ways of nerdy poetry reading, but that is like a symbol of what he was going to do in his most famous poem. This idea that he was writing new things, he was breaking new ground, he was going to different directions, but he was keeping a very strong conscience of the tradition in which he was working and of the things he had to know to get there. He was not writing free verse or a blank verse with no rhymes, because that was the only thing he could do. He knew what to do the opposite. He had studied all that very deeply, and now he felt that he was able to stretch those limits and to go further away from them. Well, please read Proofrock and tell me and tell your Hoja if you can understand it, because one thing that is very commonly associated with Eliot's work and with modernism in general is that they sometimes write beautiful things that you really can't understand, or more that you can't really understand. That was a very famous issue with them. The very first number of Time magazine, which is still very famous, had a piece about Eliot and Joyce, and they said that there is a new kind of literature at large in the world, which has only one problem: no one can understand it. And so it was kind of a dig at their expense, but it was something that had to be really thoughtfully considered. There is this instance where a friend of theirs comes to Joyce and says, "I have read Eliot's latest poem." It was The Wasteland. And Joyce asks, "What do you think?" And she said, "I loved it, but I don't know if I understand it." And Joyce responds, which is like the perfect answer, "And do you think you have to understand it? So why should everything be understandable, like explainable, if it could only have some other sort of impact on you and on your reading and on your feelings?" That's why they were sometimes so close to music. Both of them were very connected to music and knew music. Joyce was a very accomplished singer and could play the piano and the guitar, because that's how music works. You don't necessarily understand it, but you can feel it and you can have a connection to it. So yeah, please read Proofrock. Tell me if you understand it, but even though if you don't understand it, I kind of dare you not to be touched by some things in there. There are some famous lines, some famous images that keep in your mind, even though you don't really know what they mean. Do I dare to eat a peach? Like, should I dare to eat a peach? Why would someone say that in the middle of a complex thought? And why does this line keep popping in my mind in different and absurd moments? Please have this experience for yourselves if you haven't had it already. But enough of Proofrock, because in 1922, this magical year of modernist invention, Eliot publishes what was to be his most famous work, which is, of course, The Wasteland. Here we have to speak a little about my friend James Joyce, because The Wasteland has an unquestionable connection to Ulysses, and they both knew of that. And I have to tell you what it is, because it is important for our point of innovation and tradition and everything. Here's what happened. Eliot was in Europe. He was in London. Joyce was in France, in Paris. And they had one friend in common. And that was Ezra Pound, another very important name in English-speaking, English modernism, English language modernism. Eliot was reading things that Joyce was publishing in literary reviews, magazines, and he was amazed by that weird Irish guy. He knew that Pound knew the guy firsthand, and he kept bugging Pound. That was weird. And he kept bugging Pound for an introduction. He said, "Please introduce me to this guy who I know is your friend." And Pound did it by way of giving Eliot a pair of old shoes he was to give to Joyce. Joyce was constantly
So you're back.
I'm back. I don't know what happened.
Yes, I
The
don't know
thing,
either.
yeah, I don't know. I guess it's the Joyce police.
So you were talking about the shoes.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, so Eliot goes to Paris and gives the shoes to Joyce. Joyce was absolutely paranoid all his life. He thought that everyone was out to get him. And he was very concerned with this new guy he didn't know getting to meet him. And he takes his son, his teenage son, with him to protect him if the American tries to attack him in Paris. If you know Eliot, if you've seen like a photograph of him, that was not the kind of guy you would expect to attack you in a restaurant. But Joyce was afraid. He was always afraid. But from then on, they become rather close friends, epistolar friends. They wrote letters to each other because they were in different cities. And even though the publication of the first episodes of Ulysses that was going on in literary reviews was interrupted because of obscenity charges in 1920, the first meeting of them was in 1918. And in 20, Ulysses was already like an obscene book, even though the book was not ready, but the pieces of it that were being published were prohibited. But Eliot continued to receive the manuscript chapters straight from Joyce. So he was reading Ulysses between 18 and 22 when the book appeared in its definitive form. And they exchanged a few letters and a few conversations. The book comes out in February 1922, Ulysses, and comes to immediate acclaim and becomes this myth of literature at that moment. Joyce is instantly catapulted to like the position of the greatest English writer alive. Everyone feels its impact. And in October 1922, Eliot publishes The Wasteland, which is in a way his reaction to Ulysses. But people might ask, how can someone write such a complicated poem, such a profound and dense poem in 7 months, in 7 to 8 months? But that's not the case. Eliot was working on it since 1919. We have its different versions, and we have the correspondence he kept with Pound. Pound was very important to this writing, and they exchanged ideas, and Pound edited the poem and proposed some cuts and some alterations, and Eliot usually accepted his suggestions. So he was writing on something like that already in 1919. But remember, he was reading Ulysses since 1918, so he knew what was happening in Joyce's work, and he was already reacting to that. The poem he finally thought was the definitive version of The Wasteland began with an outright imitation of Ulysses. And Pound said, please cut this. Let's not be that obvious. Let's begin with April is the cruelest of months, which is one of the most famous lines in all the history of English language literature. And we have to remember, was not Eliot's first choice of an opening line. He intended to open the poem with a long and very obscure passage where students talk to each other in a whorehouse, which is an imitation of what happens in Ulysses. And Pound said, please, he literally said, the poem has to go from April to Shanti, which is the iteration of the Sanskrit word Shanti for peace, which famously closes the poem. So the poem is like bracketed by these very famous quotations. April is the cruelest of months, and then Shanti, 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 which if you have like watched Cuarón's Rome in Netflix from maybe 2 years ago, a beautiful movie about his life, his childhood in Mexico, maybe before Luis Alberto comes to speak, you could you could watch that. Please pay attention that right after the movie ends, the 3 words Shanti, Shanti, Shanti appear on the screen on your upright quadrant, so to speak. So it's like very present in literature, in the movies, even to this day. And that was pounds contribution. So Eliot was working on that. When Ulysses is published, he decides he has to finish his poem and get it published as soon as possible. To do so, he even founds a literary review for himself. The Criterion, which would be one of the most famous literary reviews of its period, has on its number 1, October 1922, the whole poem, The Wasteland. So he created a magazine to get himself published. That was the kind of guy he was. In 1923, so 1 year after that, he writes a very small essay on Ulysses. And that's the point we have to look at, because the essay is called Ulysses, Order and Myth. And he works on one very famous assumption that was behind what Joyce was doing, but that gets its first formal definition in this piece by Eliot. The question now is, why is Ulysses called Ulysses? It's a book about a guy in Dublin in 1904 and his wife and this other kid that he meets along the day. And the kid was, we know, Joyce's pseudonym and his alter ego in his first novel, A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. So it's kind of part of a Joyce thing, Joyce's life in Dublin in the beginning of the 20th century. And there is absolutely no connection to Ulysses or Odysseus or Homer or the Odyssey, unless you look at the cover. And you look at the cover and you see the name Ulysses, which is not only a clear reference to Homer, but is a reference to a translation of Homer, because he did not call the book Odysseus. He called it Ulysses, by the Latin name of the hero. And when you look at the cover and you keep asking yourself, why is this title here? You kind of reread the book and you realize that it might be read as sort of a modern commentary on the Odyssey, where instead of having the mighty king of Ithaca that goes to war to conquer Troy right next to you guys, and I almost feel a warm tear falling when I remember that you are right next to Troy. And he goes there and he conquers Troy, helps conquering Troy, and then goes back home, not necessarily in a hurry. As you remember, it takes him years to get back home because he takes the longest possible route and gets involved with sorcerers and monsters and gods and anything that can, sirens and anything that could happen to him. It's very complicated getting out of Turkey, apparently. It takes you years to get back home. Instead of that, what you have is this common guy that goes out of his house in the morning, spends the day in the city among not monsters and sorcerers and gods, but people, representations of those roles, and gets back home in the middle of the night, in the wee hours of the morning. He doesn't have a son, Telemachus, who's looking for him, but there's this weird figure who's not his son and who is also looking for a father. He doesn't have a wife, Penelope in Homer, who is like the model of the faithful wife, waiting for her husband for years and years and weaving that thing and unweaving in the night to avoid the pretendants. He has an adulterous wife, Molly Bloom, who has an affair on that very day. So what we have here is a sort of a subversion of the Greek myth. And that's what Joyce was trying to do. That was what he wanted people to notice. He was very concerned when he decided to eliminate the names of the chapters of the book that kept making reference to Homer, and he realized that it was only the cover that would give it all away, and he thought some people might not notice that. He was very concerned. He talked to lots of his friends, and he had a book published by a friend to explain it to people. Please notice that is what I am doing. But the first person to notice that and to write about that was T.S. Eliot. And he called it the mythical method. this idea of taking a structure from the myth, from the classics, and of reproducing that structure in the contemporary world with what he called the double end of first giving some sort of meaning, of relevance to the banal, the vulgar, the everyday, the experience we have in the world today, because now it's not Leopold Bloom going to the pub, it's Odysseus facing the Cyclops. So, in one hand, we have this end, and on the other hand, we have this idea of a subversion, because you're bringing myth down to earth. You are undermining its power, its permanence, even. So that's the seed of what the Wasteland was going to do. And that's the seed, because Eliot very wisely in this essay says, Mr. Joyce has created a new method. And a method is something that can be used by other people. And these other writers will not be plagiarizing Mr. Joyce. They will just be taking their work one step further. He writes that essay as some sort of a defense, because people would say, Thomas, you are plagiarizing Joyce. And he said, no, it's a method. It's something that can be replicated, because that's precisely what the Wasteland had done. He was writing about the modern world from a mythical stance. His main connection to Greek myth was the figure of Tiresias, I don't know how you say that, the blind seer, the blind prophet, so to speak, who had turned into a woman and then back into a man. So he was a very ambiguous figure, and he is apparently the I, the person that manifests, that speaks in some sections of the poem. He is the unifying figure, as he called him, not Odysseus, but Tiresias. But at the same time, he was doing something that Joyce did not do in Ulysses and would do in Finnegan's Wake. There is a very nice ping pong game happening here, where Joyce throws a ball and Eliot throws it back, and Joyce says, okay, now let's see what I can do with that. I have this obsession to believe that Finnegan's Wake is, in a way, Joyce's response to Eliot. Finnegan's Wake, which is the weirdest of all books. Please don't go there unassisted. It's not something you want to do for yourselves. So what's the Wasteland? What's this poem that, in a way, inaugurates modernity in English language literature? Why its deep connection to tradition and innovation? It brings back everything that was done in Proofrock in terms of meter and rhyme and free verse and oscillation between all possible sorts of verse writing. So technically, it's very new, while grounded in a deep notion of tradition, which was what we were saying. But also, like, structurally, the poem is incredibly new. It's fragmentary, it's incomplete, it has lots of voices, it never says something very clearly, it looks like a broken piece of something that once should have been whole, should have been complete. But at the same time, it has this clear connection to ritual. Eliot himself says that in his notes, to ritual, to structure, to myth, to tradition. It's a kind of a modernist writing that is, yes, obsessed with the new and with finding new ways of doing things and achieving things with literature, but also obsessed with the past and with the place in which this literature was to fit in relation to the past, and in using the past as a tool, as something that could give birth to something new. So that's why I think to speak of innovation in Eliot is also and always to speak of tradition, to speak of being grounded in the past and dealing with the past not in a subservient, not in a humble kind of way, but as an equal, as someone who is going there to bring the past down a notch, while at the same time using its power to elevate its matter to different and new heights. Well, that was pretty much what I had. I planned on speaking for 45 minutes. It's already 9:55, but I think if you have questions or anything, I'll be very glad to deal with them or try to.
Well, we can listen for hours. It's a pleasure, really, Professor Gaetano. We are glad. So, can I ask the students if anyone would like to ask anything, would like to talk about, have you felt while you were listening to the professor, though you didn't understand, maybe it gave you a kind of a feel, I'm joking, a kind of a feeling.
That's my excuse.
I'm joking. Anything you would like to add? Anything you would like to ask him about anything? I mean, so there are like 40 people here.
Jesus.
Yeah, it was 45 indeed. I'm just checking it all the time. So yeah, really, it was a pleasure to listen to you. I had even taken notes here. You know, I learned it a lot.
Hocam benim bir sorum var.
Buyurun. Yes, please. Who is speaking? Doruk, is it you?
Doruk, yes. Mr.
Doruk.
Galindo, I would like to ask you if you ever read any Turkish poems. I know it's hard to read poems in different languages. You don't understand everything, but have you ever tried to read anything like Nazım Hikmet? You just mentioned him.
No, I haven't. It's a shame. I'm sure I'm missing a lot. And if you'd like to point me to something and maybe to some YouTube readings, I would love to listen to them because I love the sound of the language. But no, I haven't. I'm very, very sorry.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and he's very much into learning languages, as I have just mentioned. He's an expert on that, and he's a very quick learner indeed. He's trying to learn, and I believe from poetry, just like the way we learn language from the songs, it would be easier, much more easier than Duolingo, isn't it? We have another question. Dünya, Yeni Dünya, can we have your question, please?
Hello. Hello, Professor. Many thanks for your informative and excellent presentation. I really wonder about Eliot's understanding of time and his tradition. Do you think he's obsessed with time, or well, how was Eliot's understanding of time in his selected works? I wonder. Thank you very much.
I'm the one who thanks you, Dunya. Another beautiful name.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And sorry, Professor, before getting to your answer, if you just look at her name and her surname, you can see that Dünya reappears there at the end, and Dünya means the world.
Yes,
the world.
United States.
And Yeni means new, you know, world and new world.
New world. Oh, that's
beautiful
just perfect.
name.
Just perfect.
Thank you very much
for us here. Yeah, that's a very good point. Yeah, Eliot was obsessed with time, and with a sort of an Eastern reading of the passage of time. He was obsessed with. He had read deeply into the Vedas, and he knew his Hindu fundamental texts and his Buddhist fundamental texts. They are present in the Wasteland. Like the third section of the Wasteland is called the third section of the Wasteland is called the Sermon of Fire, which is the name of a very famous Buddhist sermon. And he quotes from the sermon. He ends the book with the Shanti Shanti and with the discussion on the meaning of the thunder from the Rig Veda. So he was very knowledgeable in Eastern philosophies. And as you well know, there is this fundamental difference between what we might call a Greek, a Hellenistic vision of a linear progress towards the future, and the Eastern view where the future is somehow tied with the past and where things are bound to re-happen and things are part of a cycle. And if you look at some of Eliot's most famous lines, like times present and times future are both perhaps present in times past, he's doing like he's playfully going around this very same idea, this idea that there is no real difference between future and past. There is the present, which is real and which is impossible to grasp because it's always going somewhere. And there is the irreality of the future and the past. That comes from St. Augustine, which he had read also, but comes from his readings in Eastern philosophy and was something that was of deep concern to him. And you are very on the money when you point to that. Well, I was talking about tradition and innovation. I could have said only that, and our lecture would have lasted maybe 5 minutes, and it would be just perfect. That's that. He was obsessed with time and with the coincidence of future and past.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dunya. Thank you very much. We have Naz, who's going to ask you something, and
Yes.
somebody else, I think. Hello, Naz, how are you?
Thank you. I have a question. You've been mentioning deriving meanings and stuff like that. Can we say that poets they don't always try to emphasize meanings like Allen Ginsberg and like other postmodernist poets? Do we have to try to interpret meanings all the time when we are reading poems?
We don't have to. I don't think we should sometimes, but we are constantly tempted to do it. That's, for me, that's like the joy and the playfulness of reading poetry, because it's never going to be music, because it has words in it, and we have to, and words say things, and words have conventional meanings, and we are like hardwired to look for meaning in sequences of words. If someone says something and you don't understand, you don't automatically think that that person is a robot coming from the future. You think there might be something wrong in me. I haven't understood that. Please tell me again. We are hardwired to look for meaning in words. And what poetry does, what good poetry does, and especially since modernism, is that it plays with this expectation. It kind of points to something without necessarily saying. And that's sometimes the most powerful way of saying things, as we know from pop songs, as we know from Emily Dickinson, to speak of fundamental American innovators. You sometimes look at 4 lines of Dickinson's poetry, and they are incredibly simple, very simple words, very short lines, very nice rhythms, but you don't really understand what that thing is about, because they just like seem to point to some meaning. And those are the best of her poems, the ones that get in your head, get under your skin through music, through sound, through things that are not necessarily language, but that keep there with this insinuation, this innuendo that some meaning is being revealed, and is very cautiously that I use this word, because it's almost religious. This idea that well, here I go. William James, the brother of Henry James, the novelist, was a very famous philosopher, and he wrote this very famous book on the varieties of religious experience. That's the title. And there's this conference there on the mystical experience, and where he says, the mystical has some characteristics, and they are almost one by one possible to relate to musical and poetical experiences. And one of the things he says about the mystical is that it seems to have meaning, and not only that, but deep and life-changing meaning, but you cannot say what meaning that is. You feel it, and you cannot tell people. The only way is you have to look at the person and say, you'll have to be there yourself. You'll have to read, you'll have to listen, you'll have to try to feel it. I cannot like write the definitive experience for you. You'll have to feel it. You feel that you have learned something, but you cannot teach what you have learned. And that's kind of bizarre and at the same time very powerful. But well, I'm talking to the guys who come from the land of Rumi, so you know that the impact of words that point to something that is not expressible, not affable in words.
Wonderful answer, really. Beautiful.
Thank you.
Thank you, Naz. Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Anyone else who would like to ask about Brazilian football or samba or
I'm not the guy. I'm not the guy to answer about that.
We have some any questions, any comments? Did you enjoy anything you would like to add? Really, I mean, on the one hand, we don't want you to go, but on the other hand, I just don't want to take too much of your time. So if there is no comments, no questions, I have to let him go. Well, Professor Galindo, thank you very much for everything. And I'm hoping that we remake a kind of an online or a face-to-face presentation maybe next semester. For my translation class, I have a translation class next semester, so you're mostly welcome there. We will be willing to speak with you on translation and everything.
You just have to say the words and I'll be there.
Thank you very much. So,
thank you guys for everything, and especially for the tolerance and the patience. And thank you, Professor Öztahan.
Thank you very much. Bye. Have a nice day. Best wishes. Bye.
You too.
Now we have another class to go on Teams now together. Regents class. So everyone who is on the Regents class, I'll be waiting for you in Teams. Thank you. Bye. Bye. Thank you.
Bye.